Hello and welcome to the DevDC podcast. My name is Seamus Reardon, and today we have Mitch Pirtle. Mitch has more than 2 decades of experience founding companies and years of leading free and open source software projects. Prior to Morning Consult, Mitch was a director of software engineering at Cap One from 2015 to 2018, where he helped lead Capital One become branded as a technology first company. So good morning, Mitch. How are you doing?
All right. How are you doing, sir?
I'm great. Thanks for hopping on this morning and joining us for the DevDC podcast. As we discussed, this is really geared towards the growth of software engineers and developers. We talk about your career, share what you're seeing in the industry, and then any advice or insights that you might have for software engineers out there. So Mitch, let's hop right into it. How about you give us your story?
Yeah, I think actually you could pretty much sum up my my entire technology career with an obscure D&D reference as a joke. Is I've always kind of had the special skill of plaything of the gods. I did not have a specific goal with my career, and so that's led me far and wide. But that also meant that it took me 20 years to get done what would take other people 5 or 7. So that would be probably a big piece of advice. Number one is that if you're really wanting to progress and progress quickly as a software engineer, the more focus that you have, the faster you're going to progress. But yeah, I started as a hardware engineer, actually at Apple, partly responsible for the 2 worst Macs ever made. And then I went down the street to Sun and was on prototypes called Campus and Hydra, which went on to become their first like Spark commercial offerings, which was their bread and butter for the next couple of decades. And then I lived in Seattle in the 90s, which was wicked timing. And besides all the activities that were happening up there, that was when I really started getting into software and open source in particular. So I got involved in the Linux 1X kernel, for example. I think it was ALSA drivers for Sound Blaster cards. And
about what year would that have been?
Actually, that was later. That was in the mid 90s.
Okay, so pretty early on.
My exposure to open source, the way we know it is open source was 94, right? That was when you were installing Slackware off a floppy, and that was just how it was going to be. It was that, or you got a small business loan so you could afford a $30,000 Sunbox, right? So if you wanted to run Unix at home and learn, you had to use open source because it was the only thing you could really do as a mere mortal. Right now, it's so accessible, it's amazing. So I would say that's probably the huge benefit for everybody. Is there's all this like enterprise grade, space age tech that we all can just run at home on our own machines for darn near free.
Right. I mean, you certainly have a diverse background, right? So you've been in these large companies like Cap One. I saw that you've either been the founder or co-founder of 4 companies. As you reflect on your career, are there like 1 or 2 roles that you had that you think like most impacted your trajectory, as a professional?
I would look back. Funny enough, I would say the 2 jobs that had the most impact on my career would be in the early 90s. I joined a company in Seattle called Sequent Computer Systems. They got bought by IBM late in the 90s, I believe. And they were the ones that pioneered what we called NUMA architecture, non-unified memory architecture, which was basically it's kind of the opposite of what we're doing now with the cloud. We've got a pile of memory over here and a pile of disk over here. This was all packed into one card. So you could just have like blades, right? That was what HP, their data blades, that kind of stuff. That's where that kind of began. And that was when I really got serious about my career in technology. So that was part of some of my biggest learning. The other job, because when I was there, I was basically a consultant, right? I was a plaything of the Seattle sales office. And they had a salesman, Greg Clevin was his name, and he was always on, always selling. Yeah. And we more or less, played drop the cat, right? Where you take the cat upside down, drop it to see if it lands on its feet. And I was the cat, and the sales folks were the ones playing the game. And so they sold whatever they could, and it was up to me to figure out how to make it work. So it's kind of dubious, I guess, from an ethical perspective, but it was a lot of fun. And then the second career, I would say that really made a huge impact on my trajectory would probably be Totsi, which was a startup in the mid-aughts in Manhattan. And it was a private sales site that was targeting moms with small kids, and so what we were doing was we pinched the president from FAO Schwartz, and he was calling everybody in his address book to get sweet deals on, luxury products, really high visibility brand products at prices that we couldn't advertise to the public, or that would infuriate their sales channels, right? That's how the private sale model works. So we were doing a lot of business there. I was brought in as a CTO, and I was the only techie in the business when I first showed up. They'd paid a freelancer to build an initial prototype in Rails, and it was just a hot mess. And none of it worked. The database had no indexes, had nothing. It was just a bunch of basically flat files shoved into a database and with zero tuning whatsoever. So you can imagine it was just a dumpster fire. And so I hired a seniorish front-end engineer and a seniorish back-end engineer, and we just started hammering away. And that crew grew well over 100 before I ended up leaving, because I married a European on a personal note. So every decade we'll randomly relocate to Europe. And at this point we just randomly chose Turin, Italy. And but my learning at Totsi was really good learning, because it was everything from being like your initial, grunt programmer where you just have to build everything yourself, really hands-on, to becoming more of like a technical leader.
Sure.
And then evolving more into like a systems architect. And while all that's happening, you also got to be an exec, you got to be a strategist, you got to, go through the board meetings and all the other stuff that happens to folks in the C-suite. So there was a ton of learning pretty much from start to finish, basically across the entire spectrum of what a technology career could encompass.
Yeah,
it was all in one job. Right. So it's like maximum suffering, maximum learning all at the same time.
Interesting. So, you kind of kicked it off with your advice of being like, hey, follow a certain path, right? In order to progress your career as quickly as possible. However, when I asked, where did you get your, I guess, two key careers, two key stops in your career that really affected your trajectory? You mentioned 2 startups, right? And it seems like you got to wear a lot of different hats. So how, as someone who's out there right now, right, let's say, they have 1 to 5 years of software engineering experience, how do they balance, being at a big company like Cap One's one of the most innovative companies that's in the DC, Maryland, Virginia area, right? How do they balance being like, like I want to aim for Cap One first. Hey, like I want to take a shot at like a Totsi or a Sequent where I might be able to get those kind of, a multitude of experiences, those kind of executive experiences, the kind of leadership experiences, the kind of like, hey, I'm that cat upside down. The sales rep's going to sell something. I have to figure out how it's going to work. Like, how do they balance between startup and an established enterprise?
Well, I'm gonna use a music analogy.
Okay.
And this one I really enjoy. Technology folks are a lot like musicians. You have jazz musicians who just need a beat, and then they're off and running, right? Then you have classical musicians who they need their music, and then they need to go practice in quiet and just get comfortable with what they're doing and digest and kind of think things through. And then they come back and now they're ready to practice with everybody else and then perform, right? And there's no right way of doing it, right? There's benefits of being really inspirational and aspirational and just kind of riffing it like a jazz musician would. But then there's also a kind of quiet satisfaction you can get from really digging your teeth into something and understanding everything fully before you allow yourself to form an opinion about it, right?
Right.
And so depending on which of these types of personalities you should be able to, and for a lot of folks that are early on, they don't know, right? They're figuring that out. If you do know that you kind of prefer the chaotic, lots of context switches kind of environment, then startups are for you. You're going to learn way faster in that environment. If you're not, and you like to live in a more structured environment where things are more predictable, and that allows you to just kind of focus and really go head deep into what you want to learn and learn it all the way.
Yeah, right.
Then getting in a larger organization would give you that kind of stability to do that style of learning, which in itself is interesting. Probably the hardest part about careers in tech, at least from my opinion, is titles are totally pointless at this moment. And they never, I was chief space monkey for 20 years. So I of course you have to take my advice with a grain of salt here, but honestly, what is a senior engineer? You'll go to a large organization where you come in as what they call an associate. And so the magic HR decoder wheel will spit out associate software engineer, right? And 12 months later, when you get promoted to senior associate, which happens to everybody in these big businesses, or they want you to leave, right? That's kind of a subtle reminder that you're not working out. Well, the magic HR decoder spits out senior software engineer, but you only got 12 months of experience. Right. Meanwhile, at Morning Consult, where I was VP of engineering, we wouldn't even talk to you as a candidate for a senior engineer position without 6 years of experience minimum, right? So the disparity between these two levels is massive. And then you have companies like Facebook where it's really funny. So your title is super, super low. It's like really it challenges your ego, right?
Sure.
You're like, wow, seriously? I've been doing this for this long and you want to call me, one step up from rookie? Yeah, but the pay is 2 to 3 times more than anything you've ever seen. Right. So some places will give you crazy high comp and just an almost embarrassingly insignificantly low title. And then other places you get this awesome, like the chief whatever on a business card, but he's in a 1-person company. Right. He's broke, but he's a C-level exec. So you got to kind of find your balance between those two.
That's interesting. Does it start with having to figure out, are you jazz or are you classical?
I think so.
Yeah.
I think so. I think that's one way to find out think about your learning style,
yeah, totally. I'm jazz. I know I'm jazz. Okay. Yeah. I have to hop right into it, right?
Yeah, same. And that's another piece of advice is never, ever stop learning. If I stopped learning, I'd still be talking Ada and COBOL and, retiring vacuum tubes and stuff. And to this day, last weekend I was traveling, but basically every weekend I'm installing something I've never seen before or heard before and making myself learn how to use it.
Yeah.
And you can even give it themes and say, okay, for the month of May, I want to really just dig in DevOps. So I'm going to get into Terraform first and play around with that on, say, AWS or Google Cloud. And when I'm done with that, I'm going to start playing around with firing up my own Kubernetes infrastructure. And then once I'm done with that, you want to get into Go. Well, first you got to get into the idioms. So just learn how to write a Go program or first weekend. Second weekend, maybe try building something more sophisticated with an existing package.
Sure.
Maybe build something more challenging, or even try to commit to an open source project. That's actually another interesting thing that's happening as of late is you'll see a lot of open source projects will start tagging their issues on GitHub repos as good first issue. And
that's interesting.
Absolutely. Super, super highly recommended for anybody. If you think you're not smart enough to contribute to an open source project, man, you're so wrong. I can't tell you how wrong you are because they need help everywhere. There are almost always a bunch of unpaid volunteers. They need help with documentation, with testing, to just validate that something works on a specific make and model computer, and they can't afford all of them. So there's a million ways you can contribute. And open source can help you as well. I mean, my open source street cred that I earned back in the early 2000s pretty much carried me through that entire decade.
Well, it builds, right? Like you said, you didn't stop learning on top of where you were, a couple of decades ago.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, and I also started getting really active as a speaker. So I was opening keynote for a bunch of different conferences and the open source street cred, pays off. Like, this is Best in Show at Linux World 2005.
Oh, that's great. Yeah.
Our competition was KDE, Red Hat, Postgres, MySQL, and somebody else. I think it was SUSE, and we won. We being Mambo before we became Joomla, and so that can really raise your profile. If you're into writing JavaScript, for example, there are a ton of JavaScript frameworks and toolkits out there that are gaining wide adoption, and they can sure use help.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So there's many opportunities there.
So we in our 15 minutes, you brought up open source kind of in two different conversations. So I kind of want to circle back and just, I guess, one, talk about where you see like open source going as far as like an enterprise, adoption, because we're seeing Capital One and these other great enterprise organizations truly invest dollars in it, right? Which means it's going to be supported and the innovations like on a trajectory like this, right? So could you talk a little bit about that? And then could you also talk you won that award in 2005. So you have some vision, about what is coming and what could be interesting. Could you talk a little bit about, like, in 5 years from now, what kind of skills you think will be most in demand for software engineers?
Sure. Okay, so open source. So
yeah, first one, open source. Second one, most in demand skills in 5 years. Yep.
And open source is mainly from like an enterprise angle?
Yeah, from like, hey, do you see like a rollout of like solutions being, open source and adopted by the enterprise even more, or just, your opinion on that?
Yeah, I at this point, particularly here in the States, open source pretty much owns the roost.
Yeah.
If you're not leveraging open source software, you're at a competitive disadvantage, honestly. I was reading an article this morning, funny enough, on LinkedIn, and it was about open source being more secure than closed source tools from a security perspective. And that is an ancient phrase. Given enough eyeballs, all bugs are shallow, right? We've been saying that for decades, and it's absolutely true. And it's different now, but I remember the dark days when Microsoft was trying to kill all of us. And the joke was they can hire 1,000 engineers to try to build something better than what we can build, but we got 20,000 people looking at our code. There's no way they're going to have the kind of view of their
it's
the
impossible
systems that they're building. So it's from a practical matter, it's you really can't compete. The interesting challenge for me when I look at open source and particularly large enterprises is there are enterprises that embrace the use of open source, but they're not contributing.
Right.
And then there are enterprises that are very open and contributing to open source. And I find those companies a lot more interesting to watch. I think, Netflix is a good example. They build a lot of open source stuff. They release a lot of open source stuff. And I don't want to name names, but there are other companies that are that big that build a lot of stuff, but they're not releasing much. And some would probably say, well, let's point the finger at Amazon, right, at AWS. But if you think about it, their whole business model is based on a SaaS offering. So the last thing they're going to want to do is build something and then let everybody else run it on their own, because that's where they actually get their money back from this investment in the first place. So I don't think it's a logical expectation to say, they're supposed to be giving all their stuff away too, because that totally invalidates their business model. So that's that's not a reasonable request in my opinion.
Yeah, sure.
But I would say, in Europe, it's a little more of a challenge. They're still kind of reluctant because they're risk averse, right? And so, whereas here, you can be a little more aggressive with your use of technology. It's okay to make mistakes because you learn from the mistakes, and every now and then you don't make a mistake and you innovate. And Americans seem to be more tolerant of that, right? So I would say the enterprises in Europe are probably having a harder time embracing open source right now because it's still new, and that anything new is scary.
Right. So that's like crowd versus core, right? And then I guess circling back on like the question about the skills in 5 years, another one is like machine versus, the human, right? Where's machine learning got to go? I know that's one of the skills that is pretty hot right now for some of the engineers. Like what do they need to be learning about in order to be like a good candidate for, that kind of position that involves machine learning?
Well, first off, machine learning means you're going to have to learn a ton of higher math, right? If you really want to know what you're doing, if you want to just download a bunch of Python libraries, stitch them together, and wonder why your models are giving you bogus output, then go for it. But you really do need to learn how all of the different pieces underneath the hood work. Python seems to be the ruler of the roost. Yep. Of course, if you want to do quick and dirty on your local machine, R is always there. But I kind of look at R as kind of like the modern data science version of like Fox Pro or even Microsoft Access. It's really just a handy dandy tool to make things easier. I'd rather just use Jupyter notebooks if you really need a graphical environment where you can kind of step through stuff. But I would say if you want to get into machine learning, definitely get into higher math, statistics, probability. And then from there, you're going to find different areas of machine learning that you might find more interesting. I'm excited about machine learning in that we kind of turned the wrong direction back in the 90s. Computers were supposed to be doing all the dumb stuff so we could do all the fun stuff. And we flipped it upside down so that computers are doing all the fun stuff and we're doing the dumb stuff right now. So machine learning, in my eyes, is an opportunity to kind of flip that back around in the direction it should have been headed, because we're now training models to do things. And these things are really important. Like you'll see a lot of startups in the healthcare industry. They're using artificial intelligence to let's see, Rad AI, for example, out of Berkeley. They're using machine learning to rip through all of these reports from radiologists, that they put these reports together and find meaning and information in all of this data. I mean, effectively, machine learning is, at its most simplistic perspective, is really just using computers to look through data that's too big for a human to comprehend.
Right.
But and so far we've done a lot of kind of pointless exercises with it, but we're starting to get into way more meaningful exercises and riffing through medical data, pharmaceutical data, economic data, criminal data, for example. You can, if you're wanting to be a policymaker, machine learning can help you figure out, for example, districts where you want to focus on specific legislation based on the population and the behavior there.
Right.
And there's a million things you can do with machine learning that's valuable. It's just a matter of saying, okay, I gotta find the data. I think that's kind of like the number one challenge for anybody is okay, let's build a machine that does this. Well, okay, first we got to find the data to support it.
Yeah.
But if you have a data set, then you have something to get started on.
Right. Yeah, I mean, we're starting to see that already kind of hit, right? The components of what is a data center, whether it's cloud or on-prem or whatever, are going down in cost. And because of that, all organizations can start to leverage data. And we're seeing like IT ops, instead of them, being, I guess, the ruler of budget and where purchases are coming from, it's becoming developers, and it's becoming, how do we make DevOps a thing? How do we enable developers to start using all this data that we're now able to store for a long period of time? And it's not just, storage, it's compute too. We see things like Snowflake and the components of that go down too. So it's not like you're constrained on RAM and CPU like it used to be. And that kind of is like a natural segue, Mitch, into the time when you joined Capital One, right? Like they're a financial services organization. You joined in 2015. They went all in AWS. It's pretty publicly known, right? And their goal was to be a technology first company, which they are today, right? And you were the leader of the Technology Fellows program there. So I was hoping you could talk a little bit about what that is and what you did for that program.
Okay. First, and the thing that I find probably the most unique and significant about Capital One is there was like a moment of epiphany where the founder, Rich Fairbank, perfect name for starting this company, by the way.
Yeah, for a financial services.
He looked up from his laptop and was like, holy crap, we're not a financial company. We're a technology company. We make financial products and services. We're doing it all wrong. And that was the light bulb moment that started this huge transformation that we've witnessed over the last 10 years at Capital One. I'm amazed, to be honest with you. I'm amazed. So we founded the Technology Fellows program. The goal was to bring in high profile entrepreneurs and open source technology leaders that were, public speakers, savvy communicators, had a lot of street cred, and brought a lot of change and disruption wherever they went. And that was by design, just based on their personality type, right? I think I wasn't the lead, by the way. So I'm tech fellow number 7. I think I was lucky number 7. But I think the group grew to 20 something. But what we discovered was that we had this like super tight, condensed, knit group of people that wanted to make all this change across an organization of 50,000 people. And it's so hard to push to the outside of that wheel because that's a big wheel, right? And what probably would have made more sense would have been to have hired all of us as individuals and put us in different lines of business on different teams and different groups.
Yeah.
So that we could have had more of like a grassroots bottom up approach instead of this like coming down from the ivory towers approach, right?
Yeah, it's kind of like when you try to go to security first and get something done, and they're dictating everything, right? At
Yeah,
least from my
yeah,
perspective.
yeah.
Nothing
Oh, don't
against
get
my
me started on
security
that one.
people.
That's a whole nother podcast episode
Anyway,
for me.
yeah,
So the idea and the intent was a good one, but the execution needed work, right? And
yeah,
so, we ended up deciding that it was better to break up the band than to keep this, super group, this Fleetwood Mac of technologists,
love it. Yeah, love
in this
Fleetwood
one
Mac
group.
too.
But yeah, I think they were a good example of them and the Eagles, right? Two bands where half the people in the band are solo performers and they're all just in a band together. Well, this isn't going to last long.
Right.
But anyway, and on that angle, it actually was kind of cool because we got along extremely well. You'd think a bunch of opinionated senior, troublemakers would cause a bunch of trouble with each other, but we actually never did, which I thought was pretty cool.
That is pretty cool. I think a lot of companies right now are trying to get the entrepreneurial technology forward folks to their business. How did Capital One, I guess, get those kind of folks over at the same time to their organization?
Well, I'm going to invoke a name. His name is Murshid Chowdhury is his name. He was a recruiter. They did something interesting. They actually, instead of working with the recruiting team or external recruiters, they actually hired a recruiter. And all he did was look for potential tech fellow candidates. And that was really smart. When you're targeting, like senior technology people in your organization, you really need to find servant leaders. You need to find the outcome-oriented, team-first, low-ego types. You can't bring in the ninjas and the rock stars and the heroes. They just make toxic environments. They really do.
Okay.
And so that was something that I felt like they did extremely well with the Tech Fellows program, was that we were all super humble. The imposter syndrome was real. Every single one of us. I remember I'd been there for 2 years. So my situation in the Tech Fellows program was very solid at that point. And I remember sitting in an interview. We had just interviewed a candidate and we were talking about that candidate, and the response, the grading on the candidate was just brutal. And I looked at everybody else and I said, okay, why am I here? And they looked at me and they said, what do you mean, Mitch? And I said, there's no way I would have gotten through this interview. Are we trying too hard as interviewers, or are we trying to protect what we've got? Or are we just beating up on some unsuspecting, innocent person with just being super brutal in the interview? And everybody stopped, and it started a conversation, right? Because it was true. I felt like there's no way I would have gotten through this interview if I would have done it then, right? So somehow, how did I sneak in early, right? And that brings up another interesting point. As you progress on your career, what I've seen is that your self-awareness and your ability to understand how much you know, as it goes up, so does your lack of confidence. It will, and it's kind of funny. You can hire someone that's early on in their career and say, okay, here's $30,000. You have 2 months. I need you to build this web app. And they're like, oh yeah, me and my brother Roy, we'll just bang this thing out. And then you'll interview another candidate who says, well, hold on, only 2 months. Why 2 months? Can it be 3? If there's a problem, can we move? Where's it hosted? And who's doing DNS? And where's the SSL coming from? And they ask you all these questions. And that's the person that actually knows what's happening. It's not that they don't know what they're doing. They just know that there's so many things outside of their control that they're having, indigestion thinking about committing to this real deadline and a fixed bid on a project when they know that 50% of their work is going to be based on sitting around waiting for someone else to do what they were supposed to do in the first place, right? So definitely get used to feeling like you're the dumbest person in the room. That's okay. Actually, I would say that means things are going just great. Because if you are the dumbest person in the room, then you're also going to be the one that's learning the most.
Yeah. So that interview, you said it was brutal. Like, what kind of questions were you asking these people that you've reflected and you're like, hey, I couldn't get through that myself, or at least at that point in my career?
I just had a similar interview with another startup who will remain nameless.
Okay.
But I met with the CEO who basically, it was for a CTO position in a startup. And so I met with the CEO who said, I'm looking for a business partner. I'm looking for someone to help me run this business at the strategy level. They need to work with me on investors, work with me on lining up potential clients, do business development, but also have this kind of long-term vision for how technology is to be leveraged by this company. And also from a personnel perspective, scaling, growth, all of those things. And for me, that was like, oh yeah, that's my jam. Let's do this. Then I met their two most senior technologists. They've gone through two different technical CTOs with the same result. After a year, they decided it wasn't working. And I was interviewed as a technical CTO. They wanted to talk about dual linked lists, and they wanted to talk about, how would you deal with a, like a read through cache or a write through cache. And they were, it was one step from wire manhole covers round. And it was so opposite from the conversation I had from the CEO that I thought, okay, you need someone with multiple personality disorder, or you need two people. Right. And so you'll see that in an interview process. The bigger companies, the FANGs, as they like to call them, Facebook and Amazon and Apple and so on, they'll have like a multi-stage interview process that can be really rigorous. But a lot of that is just to kind of level you out so they can figure out where you belong in their organization once they decide to make an offer, if they do. It's not necessarily you have to meet this certain bar or we're not going to offer. It's more, well, where are you? So we know if you're a good fit for this team or you're a good fit for that team. Because you can't just, I would love to say parts as parts, but everybody's just slightly different, right? So you need to know this candidate while you're interviewing them, what they're good at, what they're not good at, where they're strong and what triggers them, right? That brought up something else I wanted to bring up. I know you're probably going to ask this question. I'll jump the gun, but yeah, advice for engineers in the interview process.
Yes, I definitely was going to ask that. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I would say the number one piece of advice I've got is you are interviewing them every bit as much as they're interviewing you. So you need to ask questions like, how often do you have one-on-ones with your direct reports? And how often do you do performance reviews? How prescriptive is the findings and the planning from those performance reviews? Do you set goals? If it's twice a year you have performance reviews or once a year performance review, does that mean you have, a path that you're going to help curate with me so that I know where I'm going? So in March, I know I'm doing this, and in July, I'm supposed to be here, and in August or October, I'm supposed to be there. You need to find out if the place that you're going, is just gonna abandon you with a laptop and you're on your own, or if they're actually going to help you level up and be a part of your career and part of your growth. And I hate to say this, but there are far too many companies out there that are more than happy to just give you a laptop and leave you to your leave you to your own devices, which is usually not good.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, there's a huge demand for software engineers. So, you being at Cap One, what was Cap One doing, or what should organizations that are tech forward be doing in order to, be keeping these software engineers happy?
Well, their recruiting and onboarding is second to none. I'll say that. So they have what's called the TDP program, Technology Developer Program. And that's basically where you grab fresh grads right out of school. Yeah. And you'll go through the TDP program where you go through like a 3-month boot camp, and then you're added to a team for 1 year. And then after that year, you're added to a totally different team, hopefully unrelated and completely different focus and type of technology. Because the goal is after your second year, you've been exposed to 2 different groups doing 2 totally different things. And that makes it easier for you to say, okay, this is my sorting hat moment, right? This is where I want to go. This is what I want to do. And at that point, you graduate, air quotes, from the TDP program and become a proper software engineer where you're on a team and you're just like everybody else in engineering. That's a fantastic program. The second thing that Capital One does, and I was the first technology mentor for this, was what they call the CODA program, Capital One Developer Academy. They realized, what about all these folks that went through school with a different major, and then they graduated and they're like, oh crap, I actually want to write software. I got the wrong degree. Now
there's some really smart people that maybe when they were 17, they didn't pick, computer science.
Yep.
Yep.
You can see the instruments hanging on the wall behind me. I was definitely not thinking about computer science.
And that's fine.
So that was basically an opportunity to join like a 6-month boot camp where you would go through the CODA program. And when you graduated from the CODA program, you went into the TDP program, which was really cool. So they actually had 2 different funnels for young engineers to get their career started. For the engineers who did get a comp sci degree, they could just go straight to the TDP program. If not, then you could join the CODA program and come in through there. And I think that's pretty cool. I didn't have the resources to do something quite so elaborate when I was at Morning Consult, for example, but we did take on a couple engineers straight out of boot camp.
Sure.
And they're all doing extremely well. I'm proud of all of them.
Nice. That's great.
So yeah, I would say, there's other piece of advice is, if you didn't get a degree, don't despair. Because one thing that I saw was that the folks that went to boot camps and then they're trying to find a job in software engineering, they're really scrappy and resourced because they've committed to this. They know they're going to take a hit because they didn't get a degree, and so they're kind of at a disadvantage and they don't care. They're passionate about what they want to do. These people will typically put in more effort. They'll try harder to finish the challenge at hand, or to prepare in advance, for example, than someone who's coming in with a degree who feels maybe a little of entitlement, because I went to so-and-so school, so sure. I already know what I'm doing. So yeah, you definitely don't discount the boot camp folks.
And I would imagine as an employer, in this world where an engineer who's unhappy could find the next job the next day, you get a lot of loyalty from them if you take a risk on them, or if you put them through, an academy, like you mentioned, in order to give them the skills in order to, even have an entry-level software engineering job. So I guess just giving you an opportunity, Mitch, to just talk about technology as a whole, right? Like, what is the biggest area you're curious about right now, and why? Or
there's a couple. I was going to say there isn't one.
Yeah, sure.
there's too much going on.
I know my answer would just be rambling on for 5 minutes. So if that's what it is, it's what it is,
One, which is actually kind of a fun response, is what's going to be post Kubernetes?
Oh, I haven't even thought about that. I've just been thinking about how you can best use Kubernetes without getting stuck on having to learn Kubernetes. Never mind what's after Kubernetes.
That's exactly why I'm interested in what's coming after Kubernetes.
What layers on top of Kubernetes?
Yeah. I mean, I remember when AWS first came out, it was, and apologies to everybody at Amazon, all my friends that are in AWS, because I have some, but when it first came out, it promised the world and I don't know, gave you like, not the world. I don't know how to say it. I don't want to be derogatory, pick on somebody's town, but the problem was AWS basically said, come to the cloud, we'll do everything. It's all automatic. It automatically scales and has security built in and load balancing and all this other stuff. Yeah. Well, none of the Elastic services were up and running yet. So you're still manually firing up your machine, but all of the tooling that you had for your fixed data center broke and didn't work. So it was like a 10-year step backwards just to adopt AWS. It was excruciating. It was brutal. And I would say that only now, if you think about it, Terraform came in and was like that killer super glue, pocket knife, spackle, duct tape tool that now you can use infrastructure as code, and it makes virtual infrastructure so much more manageable. But Kubernetes, similar to how AWS in the early years, Kubernetes as it stands right now is promising you all of these wonderful, amazing things, and everybody's adopting Kubernetes. There's no question about it, right? If you're not getting into Kubernetes, you're behind the game. However, I don't see anybody totally rocking Kubernetes and totally happy with it and everything goes exactly like it's supposed to. There are tons of areas of improvement, as they
there's so many companies that are being built to enable Kubernetes, right?
Yeah. If a tool has an entire ecosystem of people who build tools to make that simpler on top, then okay, is that tool that good of a tool? So my suspicion is that something else is going to come along and change virtualization and make it way more like a lot of the SaaS environments that you're seeing nowadays, right? You see Fastly and Firebase from Google and even Lightsail to a degree from Amazon, right? They've tried to make it way more like an appliance where you just you log into a web interface, you click on an icon, and boom, it's up and running. And the comedy in all this, here's something funny. So Canonical created a tool almost, I would say 15 years ago, called Juju. And it was originally done in Python. I think they ended up redoing it in Go, but Juju basically did all the stuff that I wished I could do with a lot of cloud environments. Now it's really funny. So you could like drag and drop things. So if you wanted to, like, imagine you wanted to run a WordPress blog, you could drop a WordPress, logo on your canvas, and then you could drop a MySQL logo on your canvas, and then connect the two. And it would actually fire up an Nginx load balance cluster with mod PHP, set up WordPress for you, set up a database in MySQL, share those database credentials only with your WordPress app in the config. And it was all secure. It was all visible. It was really cool. And I felt like Kubernetes is like taking all the ease and simplicity out of that and making me do everything the hard way by hand again.
Interesting. So
yeah, I suspect that we're gonna veer back into simplicity. I feel like we're kind of over engineering ourselves into the ground. Other than that, I think Docker has made it so that when you're building an app, it no longer matters so much what you're building the app in, right? If it, the famous quote from my former CTO at Morning Consult when I first got there, he smilingly says, "Hey man, if it runs in a container and tests pass, what do I care?" And
yeah, that's how they should feel as a C-level person, or that's how they do, right?
Yeah, well, it can be a smart approach if you kind of force yourself to stick around a handful of technologies and get good. Otherwise, what happens is if you get too excited about, I'm going to try all these different things, then you get hello world good at like 100 different things, but you're not really good at anything.
Right.
And that's wide and shallow is not helpful. Right. So, but containers make it a lot easier for companies to kind of become more of a polyglot organization and less.
Yeah.
And you don't have so much vendor lock-in either, right? That whole everybody has to have Oracle, everybody had to have Sybase, those days are gone. Now you can fire up a cluster with pretty much whatever. Now nobody uses one database anymore. That's a real good example, right? Everybody's got Redis. They probably have Postgres. They might have Mongo or Dynamo. They're probably got Elastic, and the list goes on and on and on. So, Neo4j and more exotic stuff. And then there's event source systems, right? That I think is maybe something that a lot of bigger businesses are going to start getting more into. Event sourcing systems is a really smart architecture for if your business is based around intake of a bunch of data on like a daily basis, and you have to like reprocess, and you have like a monster ETL pipeline of doom and all that other stuff.
Yeah.
An event source system means you can rerun that pipeline on infinite infrastructure for different reasons and different purposes. And now your initial source of truth is the data that's coming into your event systems, and you can just treat it like a fancy log at that point. Because what that means is that if I want to build a new service, and the service only cares about this particular subset of data that's coming in on a daily basis, I can just attach to that stream as it's coming in and only cherry pick the stuff that I need from my system. And I know that that data is living, is persisting on somewhere else. So I can do whatever I want. I can be cavalier and just have no fear at all, be just as bold and brave as I choose to be. And that, I think, puts you in a unique situation where you can do more bold things, more aggressive things with technology, and it's not so risk.
Sure. So Mitch, I'm going to try to wrap it up of a few things here, and then I'll let you add whatever you want before we say bye, right? So to me, it goes back to those, I think there's bass guitars you have behind you, right? Are those? Yeah. Okay, that's what I'm looking at right now. So it goes back to finding out classical versus jazz, right? That seems to be like the first step for these engineers to figure out startup versus large organization. The interview goes both ways, right? I think if you're a good candidate and you're sitting down, you need to make sure that you're landing at the right organization. You need to be asking the right questions. And you talked about some of the characteristics that Cap One has as an organization in order to keep people, right? And then to me, the mind-blowing thing for me is like, what's after Kubernetes? What's after K8s? Like what you said makes a lot of sense. I just haven't really thought about, I guess who's going to win that. But before we wrap up, Mitch, is there anything that you want to make sure that our listeners today hear from you, or you get off your chest?
Yeah, I would say one thing I'd like to part with, and that is technology. I said this to somebody else online a couple of weeks ago and didn't realize how profound it was until afterwards. But technology doesn't care who you are. It doesn't care your socioeconomic background. It doesn't care about your gender, about your skin tone, your religious preferences or non-preferences or whatever. It doesn't care about any of those things. It's just there. It's just technology. I think that is fascinating. I think that's one of the coolest things about technology, and part of why I got so sucked into it. You can tell with all the instruments. I started with a very different career, lived out of a tour bus for 2 years, and suddenly became a Unix programmer. So wow, that was a trip. But part of what drew me to technology was that I was able to just kind of slay my dragons as I saw fit, and it didn't force me to be somebody that I wasn't, or I have to pretend it or fit in. And I think that that's part of what makes a career in technology so satisfying, is that you can still be authentic in who you are. The technology could care less, and I find that just super empowering.
That is a good statement, and I'm glad you said that, Mitch. I think technology is an amazing thing, and I think it can open up literally the world, right? And we're seeing that with open source for anyone who's out there. So with that being said, I am going to wrap it up. And Mitch, thank you for being on. During this time, we try to bring value to our listeners. It's largely the folks that are in IT, engineers and software developers, like yourself, right? And in the comments will be my cell phone. So if anyone wants to reach out to me with someone like Mitch, who they'd like to hear from on this kind of podcast, and we provide this platform to IT leaders, please give me a call or send me a note. And then until next time, thank you again, Mitch, and have a wonderful day.
It was a pleasure. Thanks.